What was incomprehensible as we woke up yesterday is still hard to believe. The nightclub shooting may have happened in Orlando, but much of America is in mourning. Across Boston, flags are at half-staff, a memorial to the 49 people who were killed in the Pulse rampage. At Copley Square, passers-by of all ages stopped to create artwork and words of remembrance with chalk, a way to remind everyone that love can be louder than hate.
I believe that it would be really easy to succumb to hatred and fear right now, but love and pride is louder than all of that.
I didn't realize how much it was going to affect me and today specifically, but walking by here, I just felt like I had to stop and say something.
This act of hate, as the president called it, is so hard to understand because there's so many questions about what motivated the man who pulled the trigger on his assault weapon over and over again. His name, Omar Mateen, a 29-year-old security guard who appears to have been infatuated with Islamic extremism.
It does appear that at the last minute, he announced allegiance to ISIL. But there is no evidence so far that he was in fact directed by ISIL, and there also at this stage is no direct evidence that he was part of a larger plot.
And because he chose a gay nightclub as his target, there's evidence the worst mass shooting in American history was also a hate crime. But on an individual level, each of these victims was a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a friend, and that obviously has left gaping holes for scores of family. Joining me to try and sort out the latest on the tragedy are former Attorney General Martha Coakley, who was the state's top law enforcement official during the Boston Marathon bombing investigation. Martha, it's good to see you. And Michael Ricciuti, a former assistant U.S. attorney who is the chief of anti-terrorism and national security here in Boston. Mike, good to meet you. Thanks so much for being. Let me start with you. We learned the FBI interviewed this guy in 2013, and based on some comments he made to a coworker, inconclusive evidence. 2014, they interview him again because of some connection he had with a guy who left Florida, Floridian, and went to Syria, became a suicide bomber, no conclusive evidence. That's it? He's off the watch list then, as if nothing ever happened? Is that the way it works?
The Bureau has got certain guidelines they've got to comply with. If they don't find a basis to continue an investigation, they close an investigation.
And they close it so, for example, when he bought one or both of these weapons in the last 10 days, what's that database, NICS or whatever it's called? When they put his name into that, his name does not appear, even though he was interrogated 2 times.
If those facts are right, that wouldn't be surprising. The Bureau clears lots of leads, and if there's no reason to continue with the investigation, they don't.
Has never happened. Speaking of the Bureau, Martha, you remember, of course, the criticism after the fact that the FBI had information about Tamerlan Tsarnaev's travels, his alleged growing radicalization, not shared with the cops. Do we have any sense about whether there was any greater sharing a few years after the fact with what the FBI knew that we just discussed and local law enforcement people in Orlando? Or is this once again, it's in the rearview mirror?
Well, it doesn't appear to be. If they closed that case, then there wouldn't have been any kind of sharing that went on. But I will say one thing, the sharing of information, the working together of the FBI and local authorities and the mayor and the Attorney General of Florida seem to be, unfortunately, the lesson we've learned all too well after Boston and after 9/11 appeared to be very coordinated in a very good way for this investigation.
But after the fact, not before the fact. What I don't understand, I'm a big believer in privacy rights, but if it turns out the FBI, even if they say there's no conclusive evidence that there's a problem, shares at least the fact that they interrogated somebody with local law enforcement, where are the privacy rights violated? Why shouldn't it be in the file or the database of cops in Orlando, cops in that part of Florida?
But
I don't get that.
That wouldn't have changed anything in this instance either. He's able to buy
Maybe
that.
they'd be watching the guy.
No,
Maybe they'd be checking him out. Nothing?
Well, look, there are thousands of people who come across the attention of investigators like the FBI. Mike knows that. They do their best. They can't keep open files on everybody. I'm not defending, by the way, this, but in this instance, this is a guy with no criminal record. He's like many other people in this country. He's an American citizen, and he gets to buy an AR-15.
And in fact, I'm sorry, Martha,
Yeah.
the Bureau can't continue to investigate unless there's a reason to investigate. Files don't stay open perpetually in
Why
the event.
not? Why
Because
not?
it is a privacy violation. It does violate the FBI guidelines.
Why
They
can't it
be-
say investigated and cleared? So it's not just lying there as an open case
Well,
and cleared, so at least people know if there's something else that happens, it's at least in the background. No?
The FBI database says that is shared with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but it's not shared beyond the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
You know, one of the things, in the 911 calls, everybody has heard this. There were at least a couple of 911 calls. And one of those calls, this guy refers to the Tsarnaevs as his homeboys. Should we read anything more into this than he was going down a litany of people or movements which theoretically inspired him in some fashion?
Hard to tell. I think that's what the investigation is going to find out. But if this is another lone wolf type of attack where there is no connection outside of the United States, it's very hard to penetrate, very hard to investigate.
And lone wolves are, we had Congressman Keating on with us today, who obviously has been somebody who's been pretty much relentless in his Homeland Security role about this. Right after the after the marathon bombs, he said, this is all about lone wolves. Going forward, that's what we worry about. And what I don't understand in terms of investigation, if as the FBI director said today, this appears, and I'm paraphrasing, this appears to be ISIS inspired, not ISIS directed. That's a whole different kind of prospective investigation. If we're going to be confronting lone wolves in this country rather than what happened in Belgium or France, that's a whole different kind of thing for law enforcement. No?
Yes, it is. And it also has to do, obviously, with mental state. It has to do with, as many of the shootings we've seen, there's a bunch of reasons that people are motivated or say they're motivated. Most of them come from their own state of mind and their own, in some instances, self-loathing. It's a crime of hate, but they're also acting out of hate for themselves.
And think about the difficulty of a law enforcement agency penetrating a lone wolf. There's no communications. There's no meeting of co-conspirators.
So what do you do? What do you do prospectively? Or do you just say this is the nature of life in the 21st century? What do you do?
I don't think you throw your hands up. I think you continue doing the community outreach that the Joint Terrorism Task Force is designed to foster.
You know, you mentioned the mental health issue a minute ago. Let me play a little something. Someone who probably knew about this guy as well as anybody, his former wife, even though it was short-term, held a press conference in Boulder, Colorado yesterday. Here is she and her current fiance. Listen to what they have to say.
A few months after we were married, I saw his instability, and I saw that he was bipolar and he would get mad out of nowhere. That's when I started worrying about my safety. When he would get in his tempers, he would express hate toward things, toward everything. He was mentally unstable and mentally ill.
I hear the media like really trying to make this about ISIS or Islam or this or that, but it's just about imbalanced. It is definitely mental illness.
Again, this woman was physically abused by this killer years ago when they were married. She says it's mental illness. Her fiance, who you would think sympathetic to her, mental illness. How does this fit into the equation of what people do, what you used to do for a living? Does it at all?
It does, but what I used to do for a living, what Martha did for a living, is try to investigate criminal cases. If there's no way of finding those individuals who are mentally ill in a way that might ripen into extremist violence, it is extraordinarily hard to proactively.
Should we be going closer to that fine line between public protection and personal privacy so that we find out? I mean, look at the guy, from Newtown. I mean, can anybody quarrel with the fact this guy was seriously mentally ill?
But
he wasn't on anybody's radar either.
But you know, there's no indication that people who suffer from mental illness statistically are more dangerous than other people. So let's be clear on that.
There's no question about it.
No, but what we need to do, and I think the FBI does, and with the Terrorism Task Force, we're getting better at threat assessment. We're getting better at looking at these people and what they say and what they do. But we're never going to be 100% on that. And that is part of the mix that goes into a threat assessment.
Yeah, but it's like all these individual pieces. She said in that Boulder press conference yesterday, not only was she physically abused by him, beaten by him.
There were thousands of women all over the country in that position.
She reported to authorities. That goes nowhere. FBI does 2 investigations. That goes nowhere. Everything goes nowhere, it seems.
But so far as I know, there was no connection to ISIS or terrorism. There's mental illness. There were some indications there might be radicalism. It didn't pan out. Those aren't dots you can connect because they weren't perceived as dots.
So tell me why that doesn't lead one to the conclusion that if we're going to if we have lone wolves and they focus on soft targets, essentially Barack Obama is going to give the 17th speech like he gave yesterday, then the 18th, and then his time will finally run out. Why shouldn't we conclude that's what the future holds?
In this country, whether you agree with it or not, we don't detain people proactively, and we also let most people get guns, with very few exceptions.
Could you say with any confidence, either of you quickly, that we are better able to stop lone wolves today than we were at the time of the Boston Marathon?
I think so.
Quickly, why?
I think that we have become more aware of the risk assessment that we need to look at in terms of actions, behaviors, connections. But we're not 100%. And we do, as Michael said, respond after people have done dangerous things, not before.
Are we better?
I think we're better because the connections and the interrelationships between law enforcement are more real now than they were
I agree.
pre-911.
Unfortunately,
don't share a lot of
I think
we've
they
gotten
do.
better
I think
at
they
it.
do.
Martha,
Unfortunately.
nice to see you. Mike, pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.